June 2026. During an interview with Japan's Kyodo News, Ukraine's Presidential Sanctions Commissioner Vladislav Vlasyuk made a statement that caught analysts around the world off guard. He said that roughly 90% of the missiles and drones Russia uses against Ukraine contain Japanese-made components. According to Kyodo and later reporting by United24 Media and Liga.net, his point wasn't that Japan was supplying weapons to Moscow. It was something much more unsettling. Despite years of sanctions, one of the world's most sanctioned militaries still depends on advanced foreign technology to keep launching precision strikes. Think about that for a second. Japan has been one of Ukraine's most consistent supporters since Russia's full-scale invasion began in 2022. Tokyo imposed sanctions on Russia, joined export control regimes with its G7 partners, and provided extensive humanitarian and economic assistance. So how could Japanese electronics still be ending up inside Russian cruise missiles and attack drones? Reports from Reuters over the past several years have repeatedly documented Russia's continued reliance on imported commercial microelectronics obtained through complex international procurement networks. That apparent contradiction is the real story, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why this isn't just about Japan. It may reveal the single biggest long-term vulnerability behind Russia's precision strike campaign. At first glance, this sounds like one of those headlines that explains itself. Japanese parts inside Russian missiles. End of story. Except it isn't. Because if you stop there, you miss what military planners, sanctions experts, and intelligence agencies have been trying to understand for more than 4 years. The real question isn't whether Russia uses foreign electronics. According to Reuters, RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, and repeated analyses by Ukrainian investigators, that has been well documented since the early months of the full-scale invasion. The real question is how Russia continues obtaining them despite unprecedented export controls imposed by the United States, the European Union, Japan, the United Kingdom, and other partners. That distinction matters because modern precision weapons are no longer just explosives with engines attached. They're flying computers. A cruise missile needs processors to calculate its route. Guidance systems need sensors to measure movement. Communication modules, voltage regulators, memory chips, timing devices, and power management circuits all have to function perfectly for a weapon to reach its intended target. Many of these components were originally designed for civilian industries, from automobiles and industrial machinery to telecommunications and consumer electronics, not military production. As Reuters and export control experts have repeatedly reported, that makes restricting them dramatically more complicated than banning the sale of tanks or fighter aircraft. And here's where the stakes become much bigger than Ukraine. If sanctions fail to choke off access to these technologies, then every new package of export restrictions becomes less effective than policymakers intended. On the other hand, if investigators can identify and dismantle the procurement networks feeding Russia's defense industry, Moscow's ability to replenish precision-guided weapons could become increasingly constrained over time. According to assessments from organizations like RUSI and the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, supply chain disruption has become an increasingly important element of the broader conflict. There's also one detail that almost nobody is connecting. The headline says, Japanese components. But nationality isn't necessarily the same thing as origin, exporter, or even the company that ultimately sold the part into the marketplace. That distinction changes almost everything about how this story should be understood, and we'll come back to it later because it's the key that unlocks the entire picture. Before we go further, if you enjoy in-depth geopolitical analysis backed by verified reporting rather than headlines alone, this is Briefing with John. We break down stories like this every day, connecting the facts, separating confirmed information from interpretation, and explaining why today's developments could reshape tomorrow's battlefield. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because once you understand how a tiny semiconductor can become just as strategically important as a missile launcher, you'll start seeing this war in a completely different way. Before we dig into the evidence, I want to give you a framework that will make everything else easier to understand. I call it the supply chain battlefield. Most people picture war as something that happens on the front line. Tanks move, aircraft fly, missiles launch, cities are defended or attacked. That's the visible battlefield, the one captured by satellite images and nightly news reports. But beneath that visible battlefield is another one that's far less dramatic and in many cases even more important. It's the battle over factories, shipping routes, customs records, distributors, financial transactions, and microscopic electronic components that most people will never see. According to Reuters, RUSI, and multiple Western sanctions investigations, this hidden contest has become a defining feature of Russia's war against Ukraine. Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll establish what is actually known, not what's rumored, but what Ukrainian officials, independent investigators, and major news organizations have documented about foreign components inside Russian missiles and drones. Second, we'll examine the evidence showing how those components continue reaching Russia despite years of sanctions. We'll look at procurement networks, intermediary countries, and the difference between direct exports and products that pass through multiple layers of global commerce. Finally, we'll answer the biggest question of all. Does this discovery mean Russia has found a way to defeat sanctions? Or does it actually reveal a long-term weakness in Moscow's ability to sustain precision warfare? Those are two very different conclusions. The facts are largely agreed upon. The interpretation is where the real debate begins. And that's where the supply chain battlefield becomes the most useful lens. Because once you stop looking only at the missile and start looking at everything required to build it, the strategic picture changes in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Let's start with the conventional explanation first, because it's important to understand why so many analysts initially viewed this story the way they did. If you ask most analysts what this story means, the answer is fairly straightforward. Russia has spent years adapting to sanctions. There is solid evidence supporting that conclusion. Since the first waves of export controls were imposed after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, investigators have repeatedly found foreign-made electronic components inside Russian weapons recovered on the battlefield. Reuters documented this trend in multiple investigations, citing customs records, trade data, and interviews with sanctions experts. Similar findings have been published by the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, whose researchers examined captured Russian military equipment and concluded that many advanced weapons continue to rely heavily on commercially available foreign electronics. The pattern has been remarkably consistent. Whether investigators examined cruise missiles, ballistic missile guidance systems, reconnaissance drones, or loitering munitions, they frequently discovered components manufactured by companies headquartered in countries that officially prohibit military exports to Russia. These included firms from the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Importantly, neither investigators nor the manufacturers generally concluded that these companies knowingly supplied Russia's military. Instead, the components typically entered global commercial markets legally before being diverted through layers of intermediaries. That distinction matters. A microcontroller designed for factory automation may also be suitable for a missile guidance system. A voltage regulator intended for automotive electronics can perform the same electrical function inside military hardware. According to Reuters, export control specialists have repeatedly emphasized that these so-called dual-use items are among the most difficult products in the world to regulate because they are produced in enormous quantities for legitimate civilian industries. Russia also had another advantage. Before sanctions tightened, Russian defense manufacturers had already accumulated inventories of imported components. At the same time, investigators found evidence that procurement networks rapidly shifted toward third countries where enforcement proved more challenging. Reports by Reuters, the Financial Times, and official sanctions announcements from the United States and European Union described how intermediaries in countries including Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and China became increasingly important transit points for restricted technologies. The exact routes varied, but the underlying pattern appeared repeatedly across multiple investigations. From this perspective, the mainstream interpretation is understandable. Russia was cut off from direct access to many Western technologies, yet it adjusted by relying on alternative supply routes, parallel imports, shell companies, and commercial distributors. The result was not a complete collapse of missile production, but a slower, more expensive, and more complicated procurement process. That assessment broadly aligns with reporting from Reuters, analyses by RUSI, and evaluations from the Institute for the Study of War, all of which suggest that sanctions have imposed significant costs on Russia without entirely preventing it from acquiring critical components. If that's the whole story, then Vlasiuk's comment about Japanese parts simply reinforces what analysts already knew. Modern Russian weapons still depend on foreign technology. It's a reasonable conclusion. It's supported by years of investigative reporting, and if we stopped here, the analysis would be perfectly defensible. But here's the problem. That explanation answers what investigators found. It doesn't fully explain why the finding about Japanese components matters now, or why Ukrainian officials chose this particular moment to highlight it. That is where the story becomes much more interesting. But here's the problem with the simple explanation. If we've known for years that Russian weapons contain foreign electronics, why did a senior Ukrainian sanctions official choose to spotlight Japanese-made components now? Why not American chips, European sensors, or Taiwanese semiconductors? What changed? That's the question worth asking. And before we answer it, it's important to separate a confirmed fact from an easy misunderstanding. There is no verified evidence that Japan is directly supplying military components to Russia. In fact, the opposite is true. Since 2022, the Japanese government has steadily expanded sanctions, tightened export controls, coordinated with its G7 partners, and imposed restrictions on goods and technologies that could support Russia's military-industrial base. According to Reuters and official Japanese government announcements, Tokyo has repeatedly added Russian entities to sanctions lists and broadened controls on exports with potential military applications. So when Vladislav Vlasiuk, speaking to Kyodo News, said that around 90% of Russian missiles and drones contain Japanese components, he wasn't accusing Japan of violating its own sanctions. He was highlighting a structural weakness in the global export control system. As reported by United24 Media and Liga.net, his broader argument was that identifying these components helps governments understand where enforcement gaps still exist and where additional pressure should be applied. That's a very different message. Now consider the first piece of evidence. Source 1. Reuters investigations into Russian procurement networks. Over the past several years, Reuters has published multiple investigations tracing how restricted electronic components reached Russia through intermediary companies and third-country distributors. Customs records, trade databases, and sanctions announcements pointed to networks that purchased commercially available electronics outside Russia before re-exporting them through jurisdictions with weaker enforcement or more permissive trade environments. The investigations did not conclude that original manufacturers were knowingly supplying Russia's military. Instead, they described a chain involving wholesalers, brokers, freight companies, and shell firms operating across multiple countries. That distinction is crucial. A semiconductor can change hands several times before it ever reaches its final destination. By then, the original manufacturer may have no visibility into where that individual component ultimately ends up. Now look at source 2. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, researchers examining recovered Russian weapons repeatedly found that many of the components were not exotic military hardware at all. They were commercially produced, mass-market electronics available across global supply chains. That means sanctions enforcement becomes a problem of tracing millions of ordinary transactions rather than intercepting a handful of specialized weapons shipments. Let that land for a moment. If a missile depends on components that are also used in factory equipment, telecommunications systems, or industrial machinery, then stopping those parts requires something far more sophisticated than simply banning arms exports. And that's where the strategic picture starts to change. Because once you understand how these components move, you begin to see that this isn't just a story about missiles. It's a story about globalization itself, and whether modern sanctions can keep up with it. Now let's build the evidence piece by piece. By the time we reach the end of this section, I think you'll see why the headline about Japanese components is really a headline about something much larger. Evidence number 1. The supply chains never truly disappeared, they changed shape. According to Reuters, trade data collected after the 2022 invasion showed a dramatic decline in direct exports of sensitive technology from G7 countries to Russia. That was expected. But investigators also observed a sharp increase in exports of similar categories of electronics to several countries that maintained commercial ties with Russia. Officials in the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Japan have all acknowledged this pattern in successive rounds of sanctions. That doesn't automatically prove every shipment was diverted, but it explains why enforcement agencies began focusing less on Russia itself and more on intermediary hubs. Instead of asking, who sold this chip to Russia, investigators increasingly asked, who sold it to a distributor that later sold it somewhere else? That's a much harder question to answer. Now watch the timing. As sanctions evolved, so did enforcement. The United States Treasury and Commerce Department, alongside European authorities, repeatedly announced sanctions on logistics firms, trading companies, and procurement agents accused of helping Russia acquire restricted technology. The target was no longer just the end user, it was the network. Evidence number 2. Battlefield recoveries kept telling the same story. Teams from Ukrainian intelligence agencies, independent researchers, and organizations such as the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, examined recovered cruise missiles, drones, and other systems. Despite being manufactured at different times and by different Russian defense companies, many weapons contained electronics originating from well-known international manufacturers. Some components came from American firms, others came from European suppliers, others were linked to Japanese manufacturers. The exact mix varied depending on the weapon, but the broader pattern remained remarkably consistent. Russia's domestic electronics industry was still unable to replace many high-performance imported parts at scale. Let that sink in. Russia is capable of producing sophisticated missiles, but producing the airframe is only one part of the equation. The electronics inside often depend on technologies developed through decades of global semiconductor innovation. That's a very different challenge. Evidence number 3. Dual-use technology is the real battlefield. According to Reuters, export control experts have repeatedly warned that many restricted items aren't weapons in the traditional sense. They're ordinary commercial products. A timing chip, a programmable controller, a voltage converter, an amplifier. None of these items look dangerous sitting on a warehouse shelf. Put them together with propulsion systems, guidance software, and military engineering, and suddenly they become part of a precision-guided missile. That is why governments have steadily expanded export control lists instead of focusing only on finished weapons. Every revision reflects a lesson learned from previous investigations. Every new sanctions package is, in effect, an attempt to close another loophole. Now consider what Ukrainian officials are trying to accomplish. When Vladislav Vlasyuk publicly highlighted Japanese components, the statement served another purpose beyond describing the contents of Russian weapons. It also drew attention to the continuing need for tighter international coordination on export controls. According to reporting by Kyodo News, United24 Media, and Liga.net, Ukraine has consistently urged partner countries to strengthen enforcement against sanctions circumvention and procurement networks. That isn't simply about assigning blame, it's about improving detection. Evidence number 4. Sanctions are measured in friction, not perfection. This may be the most misunderstood part of the entire debate. People often imagine sanctions as an on-off switch. Either they work or they fail. But economists and sanctions specialists rarely evaluate them that way. Instead, they ask different questions. Did procurement become slower? Did costs increase? Did manufacturers have to redesign products around substitute components? Did Russia need to create more complex supply routes? According to analyses from RUSI, reporting by Reuters, and assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, the answer to many of those questions appears to be yes. Russia has continued producing missiles, but it has also faced documented shortages, procurement challenges, tighter financial restrictions, and an expanding web of enforcement actions targeting the companies and intermediaries supporting those supply chains. That's an important distinction. Continuing production is not the same as producing efficiently, and efficient production is what sustains long wars. Pause for a moment and think about what all of this means. The discovery of Japanese components doesn't prove sanctions have collapsed. Ironically, it may demonstrate the opposite. The more investigators identify specific components, manufacturers, distributors, and procurement routes, the more information governments gain about how Russia is adapting. Every recovered missile becomes evidence. Every captured drone becomes a map of the network. Every sanctions package becomes more targeted than the last. And that shifts the contest from simply stopping today's shipment to disrupting tomorrow's entire supply chain. That is a much bigger strategic game than most headlines ever reveal. At this point, I want to introduce one concept that defense economists and military planners use all the time, because once you understand it, this entire story suddenly makes much more sense. The concept is called dual-use technology. On paper, it's a simple term. In practice, it's one of the biggest challenges in modern geopolitics. Here's an everyday analogy. Imagine your neighborhood has a bakery that buys flour from a large food distributor. That same distributor also sells flour to restaurants, hotels, schools, and supermarkets. Flour isn't dangerous. It's one of the most common products in the world. Now imagine one customer begins secretly using that flour to make something illegal. Do you shut down the entire distributor? Do you ban flour exports altogether? Or do you try to identify the specific customer, the transport company, and the financial transactions involved? That's the dilemma. The flour itself isn't the problem. The way it's being used is. According to export control experts cited by Reuters and studies from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, many of the electronic components found inside Russian missiles fit this exact pattern. They're designed for legitimate civilian purposes. They power industrial automation systems, telecommunications equipment, automotive electronics, medical devices, and countless other products. By themselves, they're just components. Integrated into a modern cruise missile, they become part of a weapon capable of striking hundreds of kilometers away with significant precision. That's why sanctions have evolved over time. In the early stages of the war, many governments focused on stopping direct military exports. But as investigations uncovered procurement networks using commercially available electronics, sanctions expanded to include a growing list of dual-use technologies, intermediary companies, financial facilitators, and logistics providers. According to official announcements from the United States, the European Union, Japan, and other G7 partners, enforcement has increasingly shifted from simply restricting products to identifying the entire ecosystem that moves those products across borders. Here's how I read this. The battlefield has expanded far beyond Ukraine. One contest is taking place over cities, trenches, drones, and missile launches. Another is unfolding inside customs databases, freight manifests, banking records, and warehouse inventories spread across multiple continents. The side that adapts faster gains an advantage. Russia adapts by finding new procurement routes. Ukraine and its partners adapt by identifying those routes and attempting to close them. It's a continuous cycle. Think of it like a chess match. Every time one player develops a new strategy, the other studies it, counters it, and forces another adjustment. Neither side remains static for very long. The struggle over dual-use technology works in much the same way. Each sanctions package changes the board. Each procurement network tries to find another opening. And that's exactly why the discovery of Japanese components matters. Not because the components are Japanese, but because every identified part gives investigators another piece of the puzzle. The missile tells you where it landed. The electronics can tell you how it got there. Now let's bring everything together using the framework we introduced earlier, the supply chain battlefield. We started with a headline that seemed almost impossible. A Ukrainian official says that roughly 90% of Russian missiles and drones contain Japanese-made components. On the surface, that sounds like a contradiction. Japan has been one of Ukraine's strongest supporters in the G7. It has imposed sanctions, expanded export controls, and repeatedly condemned Russia's invasion. According to Reuters and official Japanese government statements, Tokyo has consistently aligned its sanctions policy with its Western partners. So how can both things be true? Because they're answering two different questions. The first question is political. Is Japan intentionally helping Russia's military? Based on the available evidence, the answer is no. There is no credible reporting from Reuters, Kyodo News, or official investigations indicating that the Japanese government or Japanese manufacturers are knowingly exporting missile components to Russia in violation of sanctions. The second question is logistical. Can components originally manufactured by Japanese companies still reach Russia through global commercial supply chains and intermediary networks? Here, the evidence points in the opposite direction. Investigations by Reuters, research from RUSI, battlefield examinations conducted by Ukrainian authorities, and repeated sanctions announcements from Western governments all suggest that Russia has continued obtaining many categories of foreign-made electronics through increasingly complex procurement channels. Those are not contradictory conclusions, they're complementary, and that distinction changes how we should interpret Vlasyuk's statement. Here's how I read it. Ukraine wasn't simply making a technical observation about electronics. It was sending a strategic message to every government participating in sanctions enforcement. The message is this: the weak point is no longer the sanctions themselves. It's the enforcement of the supply chain. Think about what happens every time Ukrainian specialists recover the wreckage of a cruise missile or a drone. They aren't just counting damage, they're conducting forensic intelligence. Each circuit board becomes evidence. Each serial number becomes a lead. Each recovered processor, sensor, capacitor, regulator, or microcontroller helps investigators reconstruct the procurement network that allowed the weapon to exist in the first place. According to Reuters, Western governments have increasingly used exactly this type of technical analysis to identify intermediary companies, update export control lists, and sanction additional entities involved in procurement networks. That's why these discoveries matter. Not because they rewrite what we know about the war, because they refine it. There's another important point that often gets lost in public discussion. Sanctions were never designed to create an immediate halt in Russian missile production. Even many policymakers acknowledged that from the beginning. Instead, the objective has been to increase costs, reduce efficiency, complicate procurement, slow replenishment, and force Russia to devote more resources to acquiring technologies that were once relatively easy to import. Whether sanctions ultimately achieve all of those goals remains an active debate among economists and security analysts. But one thing is increasingly difficult to dispute. The contest is no longer defined only by who manufactures the most missiles. It's increasingly defined by who can better protect, or disrupt, the industrial ecosystems behind them. And in that contest, information is every bit as valuable as ammunition. Every recovered component is intelligence. Every intelligence breakthrough creates another opportunity to tighten enforcement. Every tightened enforcement measure forces procurement networks to adapt once again. That's the cycle shaping the next phase of this war. At the beginning of this video, I told you there was a detail almost nobody was connecting. Here's the payoff. The headline says, Japanese parts in Russian missiles. But the real story is, modern precision warfare depends on global supply chains that are incredibly difficult to seal completely. Once you understand that, the apparent contradiction disappears. Japan can support Ukraine, sanction Russia, tighten export controls, and still have components manufactured by Japanese companies appear inside Russian weapons years later, because those components may have entered global commercial markets legally before moving through layers of distributors, traders, and intermediaries that investigators are still trying to map. That doesn't mean sanctions are meaningless. It means sanctions have become a continuous intelligence contest. And that brings us to the title of this video. Did Japan just make Putin's precision strikes useless? As a factual statement, no. Russia continues to launch missiles and drones, and analysts should avoid claiming that any single sanctions discovery has suddenly eliminated that capability. But here's the strategic interpretation. If Ukrainian investigators and their partners can consistently identify the specific components, suppliers, transit routes, and intermediary companies feeding Russia's missile industry, then the supply network behind those precision strikes becomes increasingly exposed. The missile itself may still fly. The question is whether the system that produces the next missile becomes progressively harder, slower, and more expensive to sustain. That is the real pressure point. So what should you watch next? First, watch for new sanctions targeting intermediary companies rather than manufacturers. If governments believe procurement networks are the key vulnerability, enforcement will continue moving upstream into logistics, finance, and distribution. Second, watch for additional technical reports from recovered Russian weapons. Every major missile strike gives investigators another opportunity to map the supply chain. New component identifications often precede new enforcement actions. Third, watch whether Russia increases reliance on alternative suppliers and substitute components. Many defense analysts have noted that adaptation cuts both ways. As enforcement tightens, procurement networks search for new openings. And that's why I think this story matters far beyond one headline. It's not really about Japan. It's about whether a 21st century military can continue fighting a high-tech war when the technologies it needs are embedded in a global economy that increasingly sees those technologies as a strategic weapon in their own right. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to Briefing with John and turn on notifications. We follow these developments closely and separate verified evidence from speculation so you can understand not just what happened, but why it matters. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.